All right, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. This is Christopher the Artist here. Welcome back on the channel of General Spear Creates, where today we continue our series of the Republic Commando tutorial with the torso armor, featuring the chest, the back, and the cod and posterior plates. We're going to be going over a list here in a moment of the different materials that you can pause with, as well as tools and supplies, and then also the timestamps for which you can follow along with the video series. Let's go ahead and begin the process and get started. So what we're first going to be working on is going ahead and beginning the kind of the rough fitting of the armor itself, specifically with the kidney and the abdominal plates. And this is quite simply just taking tape and wrapping it around yourself. Since there's no one here to help me, this is kind of just a nice way to get the plate on in the approximate place and be able to match up in pretty close approximation of where it's going to be on the body when it's worn. The abdomen section and the kidney plates are actually really simple. Quite honestly, it is just a clamshell wrap around the ab plate over the kidney plate. And so it's just a matter of matching up, figuring out where your cut lines are going to be, Velcro placement, etc., etc. You'll want to make sure that the bottoms are flush with one another. It's looking pretty good. Next, what we're going to go ahead and do is just mark off where the lines are going to be for like the Velcro, like I said before. And so we're going to go ahead now roughly assemble the shoulders of the chest and the back plates and get those ready for assembly at the same time, or at least for fitting at the same time. Just taking good old painter's tape here. And you'll notice we also have the neck seal here as well. This is kind of crucial to have for figuring out the opening of the chest and the back. So you'll want to go ahead and just slide this on in here. We're going to be cutting out the neck ring a little bit later, but this gives us at least an approximation of how the fit is going to be. And then we're going to go ahead and throw that on over the abdomen section. You're going to want to have it kind of placed approximately as shown where it is on screen. Obviously, if it's, a difference person to person, that's fine, but this is kind of the approximate area of how the torso, or at least the chest and back, go over the lower torso armor. The other thing to note is you'll want the back plate to be completely up and down, pretty vertical. That's pretty crucial to note for later on. And then we're going to go ahead and take that stuff off and trim off, or at least mark where we trim off the top portion of this abdomen section here. It's not exactly crucial, but it does prevent you from having the neck seal, or at least the collar of the neck seal, run into it. And now we're going to go ahead and mark off, or at least with a clean line, all the way around. Kind of just getting a uniform marking, and then using some Lexan scissors, we're going to go ahead and cut out this curvature. Just following the line as drawn. And then from there, you can go ahead and take some sandpaper, some 120 or 150 grit will do, and just sand down those edges to make sure that they aren't a nuisance for when you're wearing it. Once you've got the abdomen and the kidney plate all trimmed up and ready to go, you can then go ahead and prime it and get it ready for paint. And as typical, we're going to be going ahead in this series of continuing our Night Ops spray paint, this time using some flat black for both the kidney plate and parts of the ab plate here. The ab plate actually has a multi-tone effect going on. And so we start off with the black, tape off to where we have these little kind of raised hooks, if you will. I don't know exactly how to describe them, but We're gonna go ahead and tape off around this area. Using some good old painter's tape. You can definitely use plastic or paper or whatever you want to kind of fill in these larger areas. Whatever works. And then we're going to be using, as typical from our previous videos, our mix of Montana's gravel and stealth paints to fill in these areas. Kind of laying down the gravel as a base, and then going in with the stealth as a kind of an additional misted layer over. And then from there, using some flat black yet again to kind of do some pre-weathering. Once that's all painted, you're pretty much set to go and continue on. We're going to be going ahead and doing the chest and the back plate connections. The shoulder connections up at the top here are a permanent connection, and they are seamless. So the first thing you'll want to do is you'll want to obviously mark off where this connection is going to be, and then we're going to go ahead and glue this in place and clamp it down. Once you got it glued, you can go ahead and hit it with some accelerator just to speed up that cure process. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and take this shim, which is about 5 inches. It doesn't have to be 5 inches, but it definitely helps. We're going to go ahead and make a shim for the side connections of the chest and back. Before we do so, we're going to go ahead and clean up this edge to make sure that the back plate connection matches up with the chest plate, and then we're going to go ahead and divide the shim connection in half. And it's actually a little taller than the connection itself, so that we can match it up with the seam line in the middle. Go ahead and draw some lines across, and then they'll be ready to cut out and make the shim itself. We're going to go on the inside of the line first and just mark off, because it is where we marked. It is a little bit taller than the chest and back, so mark a little bit to the inside, if you will, and then go ahead and cut and score these pieces. Save them for later for ABS scrap or ABS sludge, if you will, and then go ahead and sand those edges smooth. From there, you'll have kind of the base of the shim itself, and then what we're going to go ahead and do is take some extra plastic, and we're going to make an additional layer on top. The reasoning for this is mainly because we're accounting for the thickness of the Velcro that we're going to be attaching to this plate. The thickness of the Velcro can actually affect kind of the smooth transition on the exterior of the chest and back connections, and so that's the reasoning for this plate. We're cutting along the inside of the lines here that we just marked. And then once we have those scored, we're going to go ahead and snap off these connections to make a nice clean line. And then we're going to go ahead and sand those edges smooth and get ready to glue this plate down. Just to help with the abrasion, we're going to go ahead and kind of just use some of that 120 and sand those surfaces and scuff them up a little bit just to make sure that it adds a little bit more for the glue to grab onto, and then go ahead and lather on that glue just so that there's enough to hold the plastic in place. Once you got that glued together, go ahead and clamp it together and let that sit. Alright, and once those edges are dry, or the glue's dry, we're going to go ahead and do a final sanding of the edges here, as well as scuff up this top plate now, which is going to be the part that glues to the inside of the back plate. Once you have both sides scuffed, go ahead and lather on some glue, and then we're going to go ahead and clamp this in place. Once that's all set to go, you're going to go ahead and apply your Velcro. I like doing the carpet side Velcro on the edge that would likely come into contact with skin the most. And then what we're going to go ahead and do next is we're going to go ahead and trim off this excess plastic from the collar of the chest plate. This is kind of just leftover flashing material, and once all that's taken care of, you're going to see that smooth. Alright, and next you're going to go ahead and lather on some ABS sludge to the top and the bottom of the shoulder straps themselves. This will help make the connection really strong, and then once that's all cured, you're going to go ahead and sand this smooth as much as you can. I'm using an orbital, you can use a mouse sander, it doesn't really matter, just so long as you smooth it out as much as possible. And then we're going to go in with our Bondo filler, or at least some sort of equivalent filler. This is pretty much a cosmetic. It doesn't add to the strength at all, but it does make the connection look seamless when it's all sanded and smooth. Speaking of which, we have more sanding to do once the Bondo is cured. I'm just taking my orbital and knocking down all of the rough edges on both sides, as well as the underneath side, just to make sure that that doesn't interfere with any fit or whatever. And then I'm just wet sanding these connections further, just taking some 220 and then eventually some 320 to the setup. I'm not really concerned about it being super polished, because what we're going to go ahead and do now is go ahead and use some filler primer. This is kind of just new to the project. I've used it a couple times, I think, throughout. But the filler primer from Seymour Paints is a really nice filler primer. And this just makes, you know, the whole surface really nice and ready for paint. Kind of just doing nice, even coats. Nothing too crazy. So now we're going to go ahead and hit everything with our normal gray primer that we've been working with for the rest of the armor, just to make sure that things are consistent. Pretty darn exciting, to say the least. And then once we have that dry, we're going to go ahead and use some flat white, getting all the edges, making sure that it's got nice even coverage throughout, because the flat white, as treated from the other parts, is kind of the base layer of the Clone Commando armor. And so we want to have a nice even coverage throughout. Once we have that base layer cured, we're going to go ahead and tape off some of these other sections on the chest, as you see, for the Night Ops look. And then we're going to be going back in with our Montana blend of the stealth and the gravel. Take note that I'm also kind of leaving a little bit of white on the back here. It's not crucial for the Night Ops, but it is kind of obvious that from underneath the backpack, which we'll eventually cover in a later video, that it is kind of, the white is kind of protruding outwards. And then we're using the stealth of the Montana blend to kind of go over some of the areas, not all over the armor, but kind of in, you know, uneven random coverage. And then we got the black, the primer black, kind of filling in for some pre-weathering, especially getting in some of these crevices and bits where obviously there's been some grime and wear. This will definitely help for the weathering that we do later in the series. Once that's all set to go, we're ready to move on. Which, of course, now we get to the posterior plates. Now, this is going to be a little bit fun and tricky. What you're going to need to do is you're going to need to cut and line up these plates so that the groove, the horizontal groove that goes into an angle, kind of connects up as seamlessly as possible on the sides, while also making sure that the plates wrap around or have the capacity to wrap around the lower torso when you have it on. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and glue the hip plate to the posterior plate, and then once that's in place, there's a couple of areas where the plate actually is, there's a little bit of a gap. Just take some extra plastic, fill that in. This kind of acts as a little bit of a spacer or a fill-in spacer piece. And then we're going to trim these bottom edges to make sure that they are that they're trimmed up and that they're nice looking, both on the top and the bottom of the hip plate. This also kind of helps us make the transition from the hip plates to the posterior, I should say, a little bit nicer. Kind of taking those Lexan scissors once more and going along that edge. You're obviously going to want to sand this smooth afterwards, because in addition to, having those rough edges brush up against skin or anything like that, this will also be going over some of the armoring. You definitely don't want to, you want to minimize the risk of paint actually being scratched off with the armor itself. So sanding those edges really helps. Then you're going to go ahead and use some of that ABS slurry to fill in some of these edges and gaps, making this a seamless connection, or beginning to make this a seamless connection. And to make sure that there's added strength, we're going to be doing this both on the outside and the inside of the armor itself. Sure, you could use fiberglass, but not everybody has a setup to do fiberglass. It's also pretty stinky, and I personally don't like using it. I have used it in the past. It has its merits, but if I can avoid using it, I will. So this kind of just helps minimize that process. Once the ABS sludge is cured, go ahead and sand that smooth, or as smooth as you possibly can. This is an area in which you might need to go over in multiple layers just to make sure that that transition is seamless. And then the other thing you're going to want to do is take a rasp, or a round rasp in this case, and really make sure that that groove transition is as smooth as possible between the two plates. This is wanting to be the illusion. There's supposed to be the illusion that this is supposed to be one singular plate. Once you've got things all sanded out, go ahead and take some more of that Bondo filler or whatever auto filler you're using, and go over those gaps to make sure that those transitions get nice and filled in, and then we're going to be sanding those down once this filler is cured. So as you can see here, I'm going to be going ahead and using that primer just to see how much work left I have to do. This is kind of just a good tip to use in general, not just with cosplay, but just in prop making in general, to see where the imperfections are and how best to take care of them. While I'm taking care of this off screen, we're going to be going ahead and beginning to curve the posterior plates inwards on themselves. You don't have to do this tip, it kind of just helps curve the plastic a little bit more, but we're going to be going ahead and cutting these flaps off. And then we're going to be kind of gluing them back in place. I know that sounds a little bit weird, and it kind of creates more work than what it is. But basically, when you heat up these areas, because you're bending some flat edges, you might bow the plastic a little bit, and that can be a little bit more work than what it's worth. And so having this separate but smooth transition, so to speak, can help with kind of making everything as smooth as possible. It's not a big curve that you need to do, but it is substantial enough to where it does kind of warrant this process. Now we're going to go ahead and begin working on the end caps of the posterior plate, or at least the hip plates. I'm going to go ahead and take some ABS scrap and draw kind of the inside edge, or on the inside of the plates itself. And then we're going to go ahead and score and snap these connections off. It doesn't really matter how you get this apart. You can use the scissors like I'm doing. You can use the score and snap method. And then you're going to want to go ahead and separate the halves if you've done them like I've done here. And then we're going to go ahead and fit these end caps, I guess, if you will, in place, glue them in place, making sure that things are clamped down. It's okay if it's not a perfect fit, because now what we'll go ahead and do is use some of that sludge yet again to go over these connections. Not only the connections if you've done the same as I've done with the hip plates, but also with this end cap at the same time. And then, of course, once that's all cured, you're going to want to go ahead, of course, and sand that down once more. You'll find that there's a lot of sanding in this project regardless. It doesn't even matter if you're working on a 3D printed one or an ABS one, there's going to be some level of sanding involved. Once these connections are sanded down, go ahead and use some of that Bondo filler or whatever auto filler, like I said before, that you're using. Mix that all well if it's got a 2-part hardener like it normally does, and slather on to make sure that those connections are well and truly covered. Once that's all cured and sanded down, you're going to go ahead and begin your painting process, which is going to involve, of course, your primer, as done before. And then, of course, our base coat of white. And the next thing for this process, of course, is our Montana setup. We're going to be leaving some of the white exposed, because in the screenshots or the game references, there are exposed areas of white on parts of the armor, and we're going to be keeping those untouched for the weathering process. You'll notice I have kind of my tablet off to the side there, kind of just to show off where some of the paint and the pre-weathering with the black there is applicable. Kind of just helps to have that. Next, we're going to be going ahead and painting some rectangles on the end caps of the hips. This is kind of the final step to finish off the hip plate itself. And it doesn't really matter what Republic Commando you're doing from the original game, all of the RCs have these painted details on their hip plates. Now we're going to be going over the cod piece. Now, I did go ahead and paint this off camera, but then I realized that there's an additional step that we need to do, and that's partly because Wicked Armor has this plate as, a smaller piece. The other makers don't have this, and so it's kind of this full frontal thing going on. You'll see what I mean here in a moment. We're going to be gluing on these 1 3/4 inch tabs. That's about the width of the ends of the cod piece itself. Kind of gluing those in place, making sure that things are well and truly connected. If you need to use a lot of glue, that's fine. The more glue, the better the hold. And then once that glue is cured, you're going to go ahead and glue these connections in place. Now, like I said, I've already pre-painted these. But ideally, you'll want to do this before the paint job. So it's a little out of order in that respect. Once you got those flaps down, I actually sanded away the paint from those seam connections. And ideally, you'll want to use some ABS slurry just to fill in those gaps and make those connections strong. I was a little impatient and wanted to get this done. But I did go over with some Bondo autofiller just to fill in that groove. But because of how flexible this piece is, the ABS slurry is definitely something that you'll want to consider for moving forward. Once that is all set and ready to go, you're now ready to go ahead, and we're going to go ahead and actually physically attach this to the ab plate itself. We're going to first start with these foam spacers and glue them towards the top of the cod piece on the kind of on either side of that dividing line in the center. Going around the edges will help make sure that the foam piece has a nice firm connection. Hitting that with a little bit of accelerator. And doing the same thing for the other one. This help kind of lifts the plate off of the abdomen section itself, which is how it's kind of mimicked in the game. It kind of is a raised detail, which is a little bit odd, but you know, it fits the aesthetic. And then we're gonna go ahead and glue these parts in place. Now, the thing you'll want to note is that these flaps are gonna want to be flush with the bottom of the ab section itself. Once you have things lined up approximately where they're going to go, you're going to go ahead and slather on enough glue to really hold those pieces in place, and it's going to be foam against the ab plate itself to start things off. Once you got things lined up, go ahead and clamp things down. And then you're going to want to go ahead and hit things with some accelerator just to make sure that things don't slide. And then press from both the top and the bottom to make sure that things are really nice and firm. Once that's all set to go, we're going to go ahead and cut off the flaps. You'll notice I've done it for one side already. You're basically just matching up the flap with the back edge of the abdomen section itself. So once you kind of bend this curve around, you're going to go ahead and mark that off. I'm actually going to go ahead and mark off the inside of the flap itself, and we're going to cut it flat on the table with a box cutter just to make sure that our connection is nice and smooth and seamless. And then once that's cut, we're going to go ahead and glue these into place. Now, I will say as another precautionary that the best glue for this process is probably going to be to use some ABS slurry. You can use the super glue, but in either case, it's probably better to sand back some of that paint because sometimes the paint can act as a resist. And so you'll want to do that. It's a matter of do as I say, not as I do in this case. This can still work. You're just going to want to make sure that things are really, really nice and snug and tight together and everything. And then once you have it glued in place, go ahead and clamp those bits off and let those cure. Alrighty, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are now complete with the assembly and the painting of the torso armor. This has been a lot of fun to present to you guys. We're really moving along with this series. Obviously, there are some elements that we're going to be tackling later on in the series as far as connections go, but for now, we are done. The next video we're going to probably be tackling is going to be either the backpack or the legs. I have not determined which at this point. But if you're following along, ladies and gentlemen, and enjoy the series, feel free to hit that subscribe and hit that bell notification icon so you get the updates on the channel when I post things. And thank you all for watching, everybody, and we'll see you all in the next one.